Good evening and welcome. Tonight we're going to pull back the gold-threaded curtain of the most celebrated reign in English history and peer behind it, not at the triumphant Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada, not at the imperious goddess painted in ermine and pearls, but at the woman underneath all of that, a woman who was afraid. Find yourself a comfortable position and let us begin. Our story does not begin in a throne room. It begins in the cold, echoing corridors of the Tower of London in the year 1536, where a little girl of 2 years old was too young to understand why her mother had stopped coming to see her. Her name was Elizabeth. Her mother's name was Anne Boleyn. And on the 19th of May, 1536, Anne Boleyn walked out into the grey morning light of Tower Green, knelt before a French swordsman, and lost her head. The crime: adultery, treason, witchcraft. The truth? She had committed the singular, unforgivable sin of failing to produce a male heir, and her husband, Henry VIII, the most powerful man in England, had simply grown tired of her. Elizabeth was too young to attend the execution, too young to watch, too young even to grieve in any way she understood. But the human soul absorbs trauma long before the mind can process it. And somewhere in the body of that small red-haired child, something registered the essential and terrible lesson of her earliest life. The people who hold power can take everything from you, even your mother, even your life, and love, romantic love, the love between a man and a woman, is perhaps the most dangerous arena of all, because it is the place where a woman hands over everything she has and receives nothing in return but the illusion of safety. This was Elizabeth's inheritance, not just a crown, a wound. In the years that followed, that wound was picked open again and again. Her father, Henry VIII, declared her illegitimate, stripped her of her title as princess, and moved her down the line of succession as casually as a man reshuffling cards in a deck. She was the daughter of a disgraced queen. She was nobody. She learned to be invisible, to be clever, to be useful, to be whatever the men around her needed her to be, because the alternative was to attract attention, and attention, for a Tudor woman, was almost always dangerous. She watched her father take wife after wife, Jane Seymour, who gave him his longed-for son and died in childbed, Anne of Cleves, divorced after 6 months when Henry decided she was not beautiful enough, Catherine Howard, her own cousin, beheaded at the age of 17, for the same invented charges they had brought against Anne Boleyn. Consider what this meant for a young Elizabeth, watching from the sidelines. Every wife her father took was eventually destroyed, not all by execution, but all by diminishment, by disposal, by the casual cruelty of a man who had placed himself above all earthly accountability. Marriage, in the court of Henry VIII, was not a sacrament. It was a trap, and women were the ones who fell into it. By the time Elizabeth was 13 years old, she had already absorbed a truth that most people never have to confront. The institution designed to protect women, marriage, the family, the domestic sphere, was, in practice, the most reliable mechanism for destroying them. She filed this knowledge away, deep, in the place where she kept all of her most essential understandings of the world, and she did not forget it. We must pause here to understand what kind of person Elizabeth was becoming, because her character is the key to everything that follows. She was, by all accounts, extraordinarily intelligent, not in the polite, decorative way that society permitted women to be clever, but in a raw, competitive, almost aggressive way. She studied Latin, Greek, French, Italian, and Spanish. She read philosophy, history, theology. She debated. She argued. She was reported by her tutors to be one of the most gifted students they had ever encountered, and those tutors included some of the finest humanist scholars in England. But intelligence in a Tudor woman was a double-edged blade. Sharpened too visibly, it made men uncomfortable, made them suspicious, made them afraid of what you might be capable of. Elizabeth learned, with extraordinary precision, when to display her learning and when to conceal it, when to speak and when to be silent, when to charm and when to be formidable. She was learning, in other words, to perform. The great project of Elizabeth's life, long before she became queen, was the construction of a mask. Not a dishonest mask. Something subtler and more complex than mere deception. It was a mask that was also, in some fundamental sense, real. She became the version of herself that was survivable. And survival, in those years, required constant, exhausting vigilance. When she was 14 years old, her stepmother, Catherine Parr, the sixth and final wife of Henry VIII, a kind and scholarly woman who had treated Elizabeth with genuine warmth, remarried after Henry's death. Her new husband was Thomas Seymour, the Lord High Admiral, the dashing and charismatic brother of the late Jane Seymour. And Thomas Seymour began to visit Elizabeth's bedchamber in the early hours of the morning, tickling her, wrestling with her, slapping her on the buttocks, cutting her black dress into pieces while she was wearing it with Catherine Parr, sometimes holding the girl still, laughing as though it were all a game. It was not a game. Elizabeth was a royal princess. She was also, at 14, entirely without protection. Her father was dead. Her older half-sister Mary was hostile. Her younger half-brother Edward was a child himself. And the man who was supposed to be her guardian was climbing into her room before dawn and putting his hands on her. Eventually, Catherine Parr sent Elizabeth away, perhaps because she had begun to understand that this was not innocent play, or perhaps because she had seen something in Elizabeth's expression that alarmed her, or perhaps simply because even the most generous interpretation of events had become impossible to sustain. Elizabeth, at 14, had learned her second great lesson. Her body was not her own. It was a political object, a prize, a currency. The moment she forgot this, the moment she allowed herself to be treated as simply a girl, a young woman, a person who might want and be wanted in the ordinary human way, she became vulnerable in ways that could not be recovered from. Thomas Seymour was later executed for treason, for his plots against the young King Edward VI, though his behaviour toward Elizabeth was part of the investigation. Elizabeth was interrogated about him. She was 16 years old, being questioned by government officials about whether she had consented to a relationship with the man who had crept into her room before sunrise. She answered carefully, precisely, with the controlled intelligence of someone who had learned that every word she spoke could be used against her. She survived, but the experience left a mark that never fully healed. She had been endangered by proximity to male desire. She had been endangered by someone else's appetite for her, someone who saw her not as Elizabeth, but as a young body attached to a very useful last name, and she had come very close to being destroyed by it. She added this to the archive of essential knowledge she was building, and she moved on. If Elizabeth's childhood was a lesson in how love could kill you, her adolescence was a lesson in how power could kill you just as efficiently. When her young half-brother Edward VI died in 1553, the crown passed, after a brief, calamitous attempt to put the Protestant Lady Jane Grey on the throne, to her half-sister Mary, Mary I, Bloody Mary, as history would name her, though that name came later, born from the fires of Smithfield where Protestant martyrs burned. Mary was Catholic, Elizabeth was Protestant. Or more precisely, Elizabeth was whatever the prevailing religion required her to be, because Elizabeth had learned that religious conviction, like romantic love, was a luxury that people in her position could not afford. But Mary did not believe this. Mary believed that Elizabeth was a heretic, a Protestant agitator, and, most dangerously, the figurehead around whom Protestant rebellion naturally coalesced. Whether Elizabeth wanted to be a figurehead was entirely irrelevant. People attached their hopes to her without her permission. When the Protestant rebel Thomas Wyatt led an uprising against Mary's proposed marriage to Philip II of Spain, and when those rebels were crushed, and when the investigations began, the name that kept surfacing was Elizabeth's. Letters, conspiracies, whispers. Whether Elizabeth had actually been involved in the rebellion is still debated by historians. The most likely answer is that she'd been extremely careful to remain at safe distance from events she could plausibly have known nothing about. But it did not matter. Mary's advisors wanted her arrested, possibly executed. She was brought to London and taken to the Tower of London, the same tower where her mother had been imprisoned and beheaded, through the Traitor's Gate, on a grey March morning in 1554. Elizabeth sat down on the wet steps leading up from the river and refused to move. Whether this was genuine anguish or calculated theatre, or both simultaneously, is impossible to know. But the image is indelible. The 20-year-old princess sitting on the cold stone of the Traitor's Gate in the rain, surrounded by soldiers, knowing that her mother had walked through this same entrance and never walked back out. She was imprisoned. She was interrogated. For nearly 2 months she sat in the tower, waiting to discover whether she would share her mother's fate. She did not. There was not enough evidence. The case against her could not be made, and eventually Mary, either out of reluctant mercy or because her advisors finally persuaded her that executing a Protestant princess would create a Protestant martyr, which would be considerably worse than leaving her alive, released her. Elizabeth was moved under house arrest to Woodstock in Oxfordshire, where she remained for nearly a year, watched by guards, unable to communicate freely with the outside world. She had been inside the tower. She had sat in its shadow. She had felt the cold of it settle into her bones. And then she had been released. Let us consider what that experience did to her. Not the general principle, the existential terror of imprisonment and potential execution, but the specific texture of it, the waiting, the not knowing, the understanding that her fate was entirely in the hands of other people, that she had no agency, no recourse, no protection that her own intelligence and caution could reliably provide, that the world could reach into her life at any moment and simply take everything. Elizabeth had always been afraid. But after the tower, her fear became something else, something more sophisticated, something that shaped every decision she would make for the rest of her life. She emerged from her imprisonment with a resolution that was never spoken aloud, but was, from that point forward, the organizing principle of her existence. She would never be that vulnerable again. She would never hand anyone, any man, any husband, any counselor, any foreign king, any foreign church, the power to destroy her. She would hold all the threads of her own fate in her own hands, even if holding them meant sitting alone with them for the rest of her life. In November 1558, Mary I died. Elizabeth was 25 years old and she was Queen of England. The celebrations were extraordinary. After 5 years of Mary's reign, the burned Protestants, the failed harvests, the humiliating loss of Calais, the grim spectre of a Spanish king sitting beside an English queen, the people of England were ready to be jubilant about something, and Elizabeth, young and red-haired and brilliantly charismatic, gave them everything they needed. She rode into London and the crowds went wild. But we need to step behind the spectacle and into the woman's mind, because what Elizabeth felt in those days was not simply triumph. It was something far more complicated and far more instructive about the kind of queen she was going to be. She was afraid. Not of failure exactly, not of incompetence. She knew she was capable. She had spent 25 years preparing herself, whether she had known it or not, for exactly this moment. She was educated, politically astute, a gifted reader of people, and possessed of a nerve that most people, male or female, simply do not have. What she was afraid of was something more specific and more intractable. She was afraid of what becoming queen would require of her, because everyone, every advisor, every foreign ambassador, every voice in Parliament, every man of influence in England, immediately began pressing her on the same subject. Marriage. She must marry. She must produce an heir. The stability of England depended upon it. What would happen if she died without a successor? Chaos, civil war, religious conflict, the end of the Tudor line. She must marry. She must marry a Protestant prince, so as not to hand England back to Rome. She must marry an English nobleman, so as not to subordinate England to a foreign power. She must marry young before her childbearing years were behind her. She must marry soon, before foreign suitors lost patience. She must marry wisely, but she must also, above all other things, marry. The irony was exquisite and vicious. The same structure that was designed to protect her, the institution of monarchy, the concept of a legitimate heir, the entire machinery of dynastic succession, required her to do the one thing she had spent her entire life understanding to be catastrophically dangerous: give a man power over her. Because that is what marriage was in the 16th century. It was not simply a romantic arrangement, it was a legal transfer of authority. A husband had power over his wife's property, her movements, her decisions, her body. A husband could override her choices, could redirect her income, could, in the case of a queen, claim the right to sit beside her and share her governance. Elizabeth had watched what happened to women who gave men this kind of power. She had lost her mother to it. She had lost her cousin Catherine Howard to it. She had been endangered by Thomas Seymour, who had tried to help himself to the power her name represented, without even the formality of a proposal. And now every man in England, every man in Europe, was telling her that the responsible thing to do, the politically prudent thing, the patriotic thing, the womanly thing, was to hand herself over to exactly this dynamic. She refused. Not immediately, not all at once, not with a clean, decisive declaration that would have made the story simpler and her life considerably more straightforward. Instead, she did something far more characteristic of the woman she was. She kept everyone guessing. For decades, literally decades, Elizabeth dangled the possibility of marriage in front of a rotating cast of European princes and English suitors, negotiating, encouraging, withdrawing, reconsidering, and never ever actually committing. Philip II of Spain, who had been her sister Mary's husband, proposed. Archduke Charles of Austria courted her for years. Eric XIV of Sweden sent embassies and gifts. The Duke of Anjou, Francis, the one suitor she seems to have genuinely liked, and whom she called her frog, came very close, in the late 1570s, to actually being accepted. She called him her frog. She wore a diamond frog brooch in his honour. She kissed him in public in front of her horrified courtiers and announced that she would marry him. And then, in private, she wept through the night. We have this from a contemporary account, from someone who heard her crying alone, and in the morning she withdrew the offer. What happened in those private hours? What did she think about, alone in her chamber, while England waited for her answer. We cannot know with certainty, but we can make an educated guess because Elizabeth herself told us in different ways throughout her life. She was afraid of what she would lose. Not just power, not just control, not just the throne, though she was afraid of all of those things. She was afraid of the specific vulnerability that came with loving a man, the surrender of the self that love required, the handing over of something essential and irreplaceable to a person who might take it and use it and break it, the way her father had broken her mother. She had never loved anyone, she once said, more than her own safety. The line sounds cold. It sounds calculating. But read it again with the archive of her life behind it. Read it from inside the experience of a woman who had watched romantic love destroy every woman she knew who'd been foolish enough to believe in it. Read it as the honest declaration of a person who had paid, over and over again, tuition in the school of survival. She had never loved anyone more than her own safety. Was this her greatest fear? Not death, not invasion, not the Spanish Armada, but this, the fear of herself, the fear of what she might do if she allowed herself to love and be loved too much. But we would be dishonest if we spoke only about fear without speaking about the one man who came closest to bypassing it. His name was Robert Dudley. They had known each other since childhood. They had been in the Tower at the same time, in different cells, during the reign of Mary. He imprisoned for his father's involvement in the Lady Jane Grey conspiracy. She imprisoned for suspected involvement in Wyatt's rebellion. They had both survived. And when Elizabeth became queen, she made him Master of the Horse almost immediately, a position that kept him close, conspicuously close, in a way that people noticed and commented on from the very beginning. Robert Dudley was everything Elizabeth was not. He was loud where she was controlled. He was instinctive where she was calculating. He was reckless where she was careful. He was, by all contemporary accounts, extraordinarily attractive. Tall, dark, physically commanding, utterly confident. And she loved him. There is very little serious doubt about this. Not in the convenient way that biographers sometimes use the word love as a polite euphemism, but genuinely, viscerally, in the way that keeps people awake at night and makes them act against their own best interests. She almost destroyed herself over him. In September 1560, Dudley's wife, Amy Robsart, was found dead at the bottom of a staircase in their country house. The circumstances were suspicious enough to fuel immediate rumours of murder. If Amy had been pushed, if Robert had arranged for her death so that he could marry Elizabeth, then Elizabeth herself might be implicated, or at least tainted by association. The scandal was catastrophic. Elizabeth withdrew from Dudley, publicly, carefully, in the way she withdrew from everything that threatened to make her visible in a dangerous way. She continued to love him. He remained her eyes, as she called him in her private letters, her closest companion for 30 years. But she never married him, never gave him what he wanted, never made herself that available to the consequences. Did she know whether he had been involved in Amy's death? Did she suspect? Did she fear that loving him made her complicit in some moral sense in what had happened? Or, and this is perhaps the darker question, did she simply use Amy's death as the convenient exit from a situation that, however much she wanted him, she'd always known she could not afford? We don't know. Elizabeth never told us. She was too intelligent to commit her deepest ambivalences to paper. What we know is this. She kept Dudley close, and she kept him at arm's length for the rest of his life. She elevated him, made him Earl of Leicester, considered giving him to Mary Queen of Scots as a husband, a suggestion so bizarre that it has never been entirely satisfactorily explained. She raged when he married another woman in secret. She wept. She threatened to send him to the Tower, and she never married him. He died in 1588, the year of the Armada, the greatest triumph of her reign. She kept his last letter, a brief, ordinary note he had sent asking about her health, in a box beside her bed for the remaining 15 years of her life. When she died, they found it there. She'd written on it, in her own hand, 5 words. His last letter. She had loved him. She had feared what loving him would cost her, and she had chosen the fear. But there was another fear, one that grew slowly over the decades, as Elizabeth's hair went grey beneath her wigs, and the paint on her famous portraits grew thicker and more elaborate, and the women of her court learned never ever to use the word old in her presence. The fear of time itself. Elizabeth had refused to marry. She had refused, therefore, to produce an heir. And this refusal, which has been the fundamental act of self-preservation that allowed her to rule as she wished to rule, had created a problem that grew more urgent with every passing year. Who would come after her? She would not discuss it. This was, for her closest advisors, a source of genuine, sustained torment. They begged her. They petitioned her. Parliament drew up resolutions. Her chief minister, William Cecil, Lord Burghley, grey-haired and exhausted from decades of managing both Elizabeth and the consequences of her decisions, pleaded with her carefully, obliquely, never directly enough to trigger her fury, but insistently enough to make clear that this was not a matter that could simply be deferred indefinitely. Elizabeth refused to name a successor, refused to acknowledge the question publicly, refused to allow open debate in Parliament about who should inherit her throne. The official explanation she gave was political. To name a successor, she said, was to raise up a rival. It was to create an alternative centre of power, a focus for every discontented faction in the kingdom. People who were dissatisfied with the present reign would immediately begin cultivating the future one. She had seen this herself as a young woman. She had been that alternative centre of power, that rival, that uncomfortable focus of Protestant hope during Mary's reign. She knew exactly what it meant to be the heir in waiting, and she had no intention of creating one. This argument was not wrong. It was actually correct. It was also almost certainly incomplete. Because the deeper truth, the truth that Elizabeth's long career in self-knowledge makes legible to anyone paying close attention, was that naming a successor meant acknowledging her own mortality. It meant staring directly at the fact that she would die, that the extraordinary edifice she'd constructed, the myth of the Virgin Queen, the cult of Gloriana, the great performance of inviolable, timeless, almost supernatural female sovereignty, would end, would be replaced, would become, eventually, simply the past. She had spent her entire adult life building something unprecedented, a female monarch who had ruled, genuinely and powerfully, without a husband, who had defined herself not by her relationships to men but by her relationship to England itself, who had constructed a political identity so formidable that the question of whether she had a body capable of bearing children had become, somehow, less important than the brand of strength and permanence she represented. She did not want to think about what came after that. There was also Mary Queen of Scots. Mary Stuart, beautiful, Catholic, romantic, catastrophically poor at political judgment, had been Elizabeth's most pressing succession problem for nearly 30 years. Mary was, by most calculations, the legitimate heir. She was also the person most likely, if she took the throne, to undo everything Elizabeth had built. The Protestant settlement, the independence from Rome, the careful balance of English power that had kept the kingdom from being swallowed by either France or Spain. Elizabeth kept Mary imprisoned in England for 19 years. 19 years. In reasonably comfortable circumstances. She was a queen, after all, but imprisoned nonetheless. Moving her from house to house across the Midlands, keeping her under supervision, refusing to execute her even when her advisors begged her to, even when Mary became the explicit focal point of Catholic plots against Elizabeth's life. Why did she not simply execute Mary and be done with it? Partly because of the political calculations. Mary was the Queen of Scotland, the former Queen of France, connected by blood to half the Catholic royal houses of Europe. Executing her would be an act of incalculable provocation, but partly, and this is the part that Elizabeth herself seems to have felt most deeply, because of the precedent. Elizabeth knew better than almost anyone alive what it meant to execute a queen. Her mother had been executed. Catherine Howard had been executed. Jane Grey had been executed. The trail of dead queens that ran through the first half of her life was visible to her every single day. And if she signed the warrant for Mary Stuart, if she, a queen, ordered the death of another queen, what did that say about the world? What did it say about the kind of power men would feel they had in the future to dispose of queens who were inconvenient? She signed the warrant eventually in February 1587, and then she behaved afterwards as though someone else had done it, as though the warrant had been executed without her final authorization, as though she had not in the end been responsible. Her counsellors were baffled. Her principal secretary, William Davison, was prosecuted, though not harshly, for having carried out what was unambiguously Elizabeth's instruction. She raged. She grieved. She performed a mourning so theatrical that people were uncertain what to make of it. Perhaps it was entirely political theatre. Perhaps she was simply managing the international fallout with characteristic cunning. Or perhaps she had genuinely not been able to fully reckon with what she had done, had not been able to sit with the weight of it, had needed the fiction of distance, of not quite having intended it, because facing it squarely would have required her to face something in herself that she had spent 60 years learning not to look at directly, that she was capable of the same thing they had done to her mother. That power, in the end, makes everyone capable of everything. Elizabeth I died on the 24th of March, 1603. She was 69 years old. By the standards of her era, this was a remarkable age for anyone, and for a woman who had survived the childhood she had survived, it was almost defiant. In her final years, she'd grown old in the particular way that powerful people grow old when they have long refused to acknowledge their own vulnerability. She wore white face paint and red wigs. She insisted on being depicted in portraits as she had looked at the height of her beauty, pale and regal and ageless, rather than as she actually looked. She raged at anyone who reminded her of what she was becoming. She had outlived almost everyone she had loved. Dudley was gone. Burghley was gone. The young men she had surrounded herself with in her old age, Essex, the dashing and reckless Earl of Essex, who had briefly been her last great favourite, had turned rebel, had marched on London, had been tried and executed. She had signed that warrant too, and it had broken something in her that never quite healed. In her final months, she refused to go to bed. She sat on cushions on the floor of her chamber, staring into the middle distance, and would not sleep. Whether this was physical, the insomnia of an old woman in pain, or psychological, the behavior of a mind that could not stop, could not rest, could not release its vigilance even now is impossible to say with certainty. Her godson, John Harrington, came to visit her near the end and was shaken by what he found. She was diminished, he wrote, skeletal, fierce, still sharp enough to discuss Latin quotations with him, but fragile in a way he had never seen before. She told him that she did not sleep well, that she was not well, that she was tired. She never said she was afraid. She had never said she was afraid. Not once in 60 years of public life had Elizabeth I allowed the word to be used about her without immediately and decisively dismantling it. Fear was for other people. Fear was for the women who had married and been destroyed. Fear was for the queens who had not known how to protect themselves. But we know better. We know because the entire architecture of her life was built around fear, and the management of fear and the transformation of fear into something that looked, from the outside, like absolute certainty. She was afraid that love would destroy her, the way it had destroyed her mother. So she refused to love in any way that gave the beloved power over her fate. Or she loved, as with Dudley, but never completely enough to surrender her own agency. She was afraid that vulnerability would be exploited, the way Thomas Seymour had exploited it when she was a 14-year-old girl with no one to protect her. So she built around herself an impregnable persona, the Virgin Queen, Gloriana, the almost supernatural embodiment of England itself, that was not vulnerable to anything so ordinary as a man's appetite. She was afraid of what marriage would require her to give up, so she never married, and made of her solitude a kind of sovereignty. She was afraid of time and death and replacement and irrelevance, so she refused to name a successor, and refused to look in mirrors, and refused to go to sleep. And she was afraid, perhaps most secretly, most deeply afraid, of what it meant to hold the power she held, of what she was capable of doing with it, of the ways in which the extraordinary strength she had built to protect herself had also made her capable of cruelty she would never fully acknowledge. Her mother's ghost walked behind her for 69 years. Anne Boleyn, who had loved a king and been destroyed by it. Anne Boleyn, who had been clever and fierce and full of life, and who had ended on a scaffold in the May sunshine with a French swordsman standing behind her. Elizabeth had seen to it that no one could do that to her, but the question she never answered, the question she perhaps spent her entire life running from, was whether the armor she had built had also sealed her in, whether in refusing to be destroyed by love, she had also refused to be fully alive to it. Whether the woman inside the performance of the Virgin Queen had sometimes, in the darkest hours of the night, sitting alone with a box of old letters beside her bed, wished she had been brave enough to choose differently. She never told us. That was perhaps her greatest power and her greatest fear, and in the end they were the same thing. She named James of Scotland as her successor in her final hours, wordlessly, reportedly, by touching her head with her fingers when his name was mentioned, unable or unwilling to say it aloud even then. She'd kept that particular act of relinquishment until she had absolutely no choice, and then England's greatest queen let go. She had never stopped being afraid. She had simply never, not once in 69 years, let it stop her. And perhaps that is the most honest thing we can say about Elizabeth I. Not that she was fearless, because she was not, but that she understood, more completely than almost anyone who has ever lived, the difference between being afraid and being defeated. She gathered her fears the way other people gather weapons, and she used them. She used them to stay sharp, to stay watchful, to stay alive in a world that had been trying, since the day she was born, to find a way to diminish her. The girl who sat on the wet steps of Traitor's Gate in the rain became the woman who stood before her troops at Tilbury and told them she had the heart and stomach of a king. Both of those women were real. Both of them were afraid, and both of them refused to look away. So tonight, as you settle into the quiet dark, perhaps that is the thought worth carrying with you. Not the portraits, not the pearls, not the mythology of the Virgin Queen untouched by time or feeling, but the woman underneath, exhausted, brilliant, lonely and resolute, who made of her deepest wounds the foundation of something that lasted. That is worth remembering. Sleep well,